treated to an endless litany of bitter complaints and self-pitying sighs. And when this woman can no longer bludgeon, browbeat, or bully her nieces into coming to see her, she has one of her spells. She develops a heart attack. Is the heart attack real? Yes. The doctors say she has a nervous heart, suffers from palpitations. But the doctors also say they can do nothing for her. Her trouble is emotional. What this woman really wants is love and attention, but she calls it gratitude. And she will never get gratitude or love because she demands it. She thinks it's her due. And there are thousands of people like her, people who are ill from ingratitude, loneliness, and neglect. They long to be loved, but the only way in this world that they can ever hope to be loved is to stop asking for it and to start pouring out love without hope of return. Does that sound like sheer, impractical, visionary idealism? It isn't. It's just horse sense. It's a good way for you and me to find the happiness we long for. I know. I have seen it happen right in my own family. My own mother and father gave for the joy of helping others. We were poor, always overwhelmed with debts, yet poor as we were, my father and mother always managed to send money every year to an orphan's home, the Christian home in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Mother and father never visited that home. Probably no one thanked them for their gifts except by letter, but they were richly repaid, for they had the joy of helping little children, without wishing for or expecting any gratitude in return. After I left home, I would always send father and mother a check at Christmas and urge them to indulge in a few luxuries for themselves, but they rarely did. When I came home a few days before Christmas, Father would tell me of the coal and groceries they'd bought for some widow woman in town who had a lot of children and no money to buy food and fuel. What joy they got out of giving these gifts, the joy of giving without expecting anything whatever in return. I believe my father would almost have qualified for Aristotle's description of the ideal man, the man most worthy of being happy. The ideal man, said Aristotle, takes joy in doing favors for others. Now, here's the second point I'm trying to make in this chapter. If we want to find happiness, let's stop thinking about gratitude or ingratitude and give for the inner joy of giving. Parents have been tearing their hair about the ingratitude of children for 10,000 years. Even Shakespeare's King Lear cried out, "How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child." But why should children be thankful, unless we train them to be? Ingratitude is natural, like weeds. Gratitude is like a rose. It has to be fed and watered and cultivated and loved and protected. If our children are ungrateful, who's to blame? Maybe we are. If we have never taught them to express gratitude to others, how can we expect them to be grateful to us? I knew a man in Chicago who had cause to complain of the ingratitude of his stepsons. He slaved in a box factory, seldom earning more than $40 a week. He married a widow, and she persuaded him to borrow money and send her 2 grown sons to college. Out of his salary of $40 a week, he had to pay for food, rent, fuel, clothes, and also for the payments on his note. He did this for 4 years, working like a coolie and never complaining. Did he get any thanks? No. His wife took it all for granted, and so did her sons. They never imagined that they owed their stepfather anything, not even thanks. Who was to blame? The boys? Yes, but the mother was even more to blame. She thought it was a shame to burden their young lives with a sense of obligation. She didn't want her sons to start out under debt, so she never dreamed of saying, "What a prince your stepfather is to help you through college." Instead, she took the attitude, "Oh, that's the least he can do." She thought she was sparing her sons, but in reality she was sending them out into life with the dangerous idea that the world owed them a living. And it was a dangerous idea, for one of those sons tried to borrow from an employer and ended up in jail. We must remember that our children are very much what we make them. For example, my mother's sister, Viola Alexander of Minneapolis, is a shining example of a woman who never had cause to complain about the ingratitude of children. When I was a boy, Aunt Viola took her own mother into her home to love and take care of, and she did the same thing for her husband's mother. I can still close my eyes and see those two old ladies sitting before the fire in Aunt Viola's farmhouse. Were they any trouble to Aunt Viola? Often, I suppose. But you never would have guessed it from her attitude. She loved those old ladies. She pampered them and spoiled them and made them feel at home. In addition, Aunt Viola had 6 children of her own, but it never occurred to her that she was doing anything especially noble or deserved any halos for taking those old ladies into her home. To her, it was the natural thing, the right thing, the thing she wanted to do. Now, where is Aunt Viola today? Well, she's now been a widow for 20-odd years, and she has 5 grown-up children, 5 separate households, all clamoring to share her and to have her come and live in their homes. Her children adore her. They never get enough of her. Out of gratitude? Nonsense. It is love, sheer love. Those children breathed in warmth and radiant human kindness all during their childhoods. Is it any wonder that now that the situation is reversed, they give back love? So let us remember that to raise grateful children, we have to be grateful. Let us remember little pitchers have big ears, and watch what we say. To illustrate, the next time we're tempted to belittle someone's kindness in the presence of our children, let's stop. Let's never say, "Look at these dishcloths Cousin Sue sent for Christmas. She knit them herself. They didn't cost her a cent." The remark may seem trivial to us, but the children are listening. So instead we'd better say, "Look at the hours Cousin Sue spent making these for Christmas. Isn't she nice? Let's write her a thank you note right now." And our children may unconsciously absorb the habit of praise and appreciation. To avoid resentment and worry over ingratitude, here is Rule 3. A. Instead of worrying about ingratitude, let's expect it. Let's remember that Jesus healed 10 lepers in one day, and only 1 thanked him. Why should we expect more gratitude than Jesus got? B. Let's remember that the only way to find happiness is not to expect gratitude, but to give for the joy of giving. C. Let's remember that gratitude is a cultivated trait. So if we want our children to be grateful, we must train them to be grateful. Chapter 15. Would you take $1 million for what you have? I have known Harold Abbott for years. He lived in Webb City, Missouri. He used to be my lecture manager. One day he and I met in Kansas City, and he drove me down to my farm in Belton, Missouri. During that drive, I asked him how he kept from worrying, and he told me an inspiring story I shall never forget. "I used to worry a lot," he said. "But one spring day in 1934, I was walking down West Dougherty Street in Webb City. I saw a sight that banished all my worries. It happened in 10 seconds. But during those 10 seconds, I learned more about how to live than I had learned in the previous 10 years. For 2 years I'd been running a grocery store in Webb City," Harold Abbott said, as he told me the story. "I had not only lost all my savings, but I had incurred debts that took me 7 years to pay back. My grocery store had been closed the previous Saturday, and now I was going to the Merchants and Miners Bank to borrow money so I could go to Kansas City to look for a job. I walked like a beaten man. I'd lost all my fight and faith. Then suddenly, coming down the street, I saw a man who had no legs. He was sitting on a little wooden platform equipped with wheels from roller skates. He propelled himself along the street with a block of wood in each hand. I met him just after he crossed the street and was starting to lift himself up a few inches over the curb to the sidewalk. As he tilted his little wooden platform to an angle, his eyes met mine. He greeted me with a grand smile. "Morning, sir. It's a fine morning, isn't it?" he said with spirit. As I stood looking at him, I realized how rich I was. I had 2 legs, I could walk. I felt ashamed of my self-pity. I said to myself, if he can be happy, cheerful, and confident without legs, I certainly can with legs. I could already feel my chest lifting. I had intended to ask the Merchants and Miners Bank for only $100, but now I had courage to ask for $200. I had intended to say that I wanted to go to Kansas City to try to get a job, but now I announced confidently that I wanted to go to Kansas City to get a job. I got the loan, and I got the job. I now have the following words pasted on my bathroom mirror, and I read them every morning as I shave. I had the blues because I had no shoes, until upon the street I met a man who had no feet. I once asked Eddie Rickenbacker what was the biggest lesson he had learned from drifting about with his companions in life rafts for 21 days, hopelessly lost in the Pacific. The biggest lesson I learned from that experience, he said, was that if you have all the fresh water you want to drink and all the food you want to eat, you ought never to complain about anything. Time ran an article about a sergeant who had been wounded on Guadalcanal. Hit in the throat by a shell fragment, this sergeant had 7 blood transfusions. Writing a note to his doctor, he asked, "Will I live?" The doctor replied, "Yes." He wrote another note asking, "Will I be able to talk?" Again, the answer was yes. Then he wrote another note saying, "Then what in the hell am I worrying about?" Why don't you stop right now and ask yourself, what in the hell am I worrying about? You will probably find that it is comparatively unimportant and insignificant. About 90% of the things in our lives are right, and about 10% are wrong. If we want to be happy, all we have to do is concentrate on the 90% that are right, and ignore the 10% that are wrong. If we want to be worried and bitter and have stomach ulcers, all we have to do is concentrate on the 10% that are wrong and ignore the 90% that are glorious. The words think and thank are inscribed in many of the Cromwellian churches of England. These words ought to be inscribed in our hearts, too. Think and thank. Think of all we have to be grateful for, and thank God for all our boons and bounties. Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels, was the most devastating pessimist in English literature. He was so sorry that he had been born that he wore black and fasted on his birthdays. Yet in his despair, this supreme pessimist of English literature praised the great health-giving powers of cheerfulness and happiness. The best doctors in the world, he declared, are Dr. Diet, Dr. Quiet, and Dr. Merryman. You and I may have the services of Dr. Merryman free every hour of the day by keeping our attention fixed on all the incredible riches we possess, riches exceeding by far the fabled treasures of Ali Baba. Would you sell both your eyes for $1 billion? What would you take for your 2 legs, your hands, your hearing, your children, your family? Add up your assets, and you will find that you won't sell what you have for all the gold ever amassed by the Rockefellers, the Fords, and the Morgans combined. But do we appreciate all this? Ah, no. As Schopenhauer said, we seldom think of what we have, but always of what we lack. Yes, the tendency to seldom think of what we have, but always of what we lack, is the greatest tragedy on earth. It has probably caused more misery than all the wars and diseases in history. It caused John Palmer to turn from a regular guy into an old grouch and almost wreck his home. I know, because he told me so. Mr. Palmer lives in Paterson, New Jersey. Shortly after I returned